There is a number that almost everyone secretly carries in their mind, a figure that, if reached, would supposedly mean they've made it. Enough. Safe. Free. And the strange thing about this number is that almost nobody who reaches it actually feels the thing they thought it would give them. They simply generate a new number, quietly, almost without noticing, and the chase continues, 1 0 further away. The common story about wealth is simple, almost mathematically clean. More money solves more problems, and enough money solves all of them. We assume, without ever quite examining it, that financial anxiety is a math problem, that the discomfort you feel about money will dissolve once the balance in the account grows large enough. So we chase the raise, the bonus, the next rung on the ladder, certain that somewhere up ahead is a specific figure that will finally let us exhale. But talk to people who have actually reached the number they once swore would be enough, and something curious happens. The exhale rarely comes. Researchers studying the relationship between income and well-being have found the same pattern again and again. Happiness rises steeply with income at first, climbing quickly out of poverty and scarcity, but the curve begins to flatten long before most people expect it to. Beyond a certain point, additional income keeps arriving, but the felt sense of security, ease, and contentment stops arriving with it. The graph keeps climbing. The peace doesn't. Which raises the uncomfortable question underneath this entire subject. If money isn't actually buying the peace we assumed it would, what exactly are we chasing when we chase it? To understand this, you have to separate two things that feel identical from the inside but are, psychologically, almost entirely different: wealth as security and wealth as status. Security is finite, measurable, and achievable: a certain amount of savings, a paid-off home, an emergency fund that means a single bad month won't collapse your life. Most financial anxiety, at its root, is really an anxiety about security, and security has a ceiling. Once you have enough runway to survive a crisis, more money does very little to deepen that particular sense of safety. Status, on the other hand, has no ceiling at all, because status was never about your own resources. It was always a comparison to someone else's. This is where the psychology of wealth reveals its hidden architecture. Human beings did not evolve in a world of absolute numbers. We evolved in small tribes where survival depended on relative position, where being slightly better resourced than your neighbor might mean the difference between eating through winter and not. The economist Thorstein Veblen, writing over a century ago, gave this instinct a name that has outlived nearly everything else he wrote: conspicuous consumption, the acquisition and display of wealth not for its use, but for what it signals to others about your position in the hierarchy. And the unsettling implication of Veblen's insight is this: a great deal of what we call financial goals are not really about money at all. They are about rank. This explains something that pure economics struggles to explain on its own: why doubling everyone's income in a society does remarkably little to increase overall happiness, even though everyone, individually, would say they'd be thrilled to have double their salary. If your neighbor's income doubles too, your relative position hasn't moved at all. You are exactly as far ahead, or as far behind, as you were before. The economist Richard S. Turlin observed this so consistently across decades of data that it now carries his name: the S. Turlin paradox, the strange finding that as entire nations grow wealthier, average reported happiness barely moves, because the goalposts of enough rise in perfect lockstep with the income itself. Which means the target was never a fixed number. It was always a moving reflection of whoever happened to be standing next to you. This is worth sitting with, because it explains a pattern that quietly haunts a great number of financially successful people: the persistent, nagging sense of being behind, even at income levels the vast majority of the world would consider extraordinary. It isn't hypocrisy, and it isn't ingratitude. It's the simple, mechanical result of a mind that measures wealth the way it measures everything else, not in absolute terms, but relative to a reference point. And in a hyper-connected world, that reference point is no longer the neighbor down the street. It's a curated, algorithmically amplified stream of people who appear to have more, chosen by the platform precisely because they represent an extreme most of us will never see in daily life. Behavioral economists call this general phenomenon reference dependence, and it means something quietly devastating. Your sense of financial adequacy was never really about how much you have. It's about the gap between what you have and whatever your mind has selected, often unconsciously, as the relevant comparison. But there's a second, older layer buried beneath the status chase, and it goes back further than any economic theory, back to what money actually represents to the nervous system in the first place. For most of human history, resources meant survival in the most literal sense. Food stores meant surviving winter. Livestock meant surviving drought. A community's willingness to share meant surviving illness or injury that would otherwise be fatal. Scarcity wasn't an abstract fear. It was a regular, lived reality, and the nervous systems that survived it were the ones exquisitely tuned to notice threat, hoard resources, and never quite relax the vigilance, even in times of apparent abundance. This is the evolutionary residue still running underneath modern financial anxiety, a threat detection system built for genuine scarcity, now running inside lives that, for many people reading this, contain more material abundance than almost any humans in history have ever known. The body doesn't know the difference between, I might not survive winter, and I might not be able to afford the mortgage if I lose this job. Both register, physiologically, as the same ancient alarm. This is why financial anxiety so often persists independent of actual financial facts. Someone with a comfortable savings cushion can lie awake with the exact same tight chest, the exact same looping dread, as someone with genuinely precarious finances, because the nervous system isn't responding to a spreadsheet. It's responding to a felt sense of safety, and felt safety, it turns out, has surprisingly little to do with the number in the account, and a great deal to do with a person's early relationship to scarcity itself. Consider two people who grew up in the same neighborhood, with similar incomes as adults. One grew up in a household where money was discussed calmly, where scarcity, when it existed, was framed as temporary and manageable. The other grew up watching a parent's face tighten every time a bill arrived, absorbing, long before they understood a single financial concept. The world is not safe, and resources can vanish without warning. As adults, both may earn identical salaries. But their nervous systems inherited entirely different relationships to money, and no amount of adult income fully overwrites what was absorbed before the age of 10. Psychologists studying what's sometimes called money scripts have found that these early, often unconscious beliefs about money, scarcity, unworthiness, status, secrecy, predict financial behavior and financial anxiety far more reliably than actual income does. Which means the voice that says you don't have enough is very often not commenting on your bank statement at all. It's replaying a much older recording, made in a childhood kitchen long before you ever owned a single asset. This reframes the entire chase in an uncomfortable but clarifying way. If financial anxiety were purely mathematical, it would resolve with math. A bigger number would produce a calmer nervous system. But for so many people, it doesn't, because the anxiety was never actually about the math. It was about an old, embodied belief that safety is conditional and always one crisis away from collapsing, a belief that no amount of accumulation can fully argue with, because it isn't operating in the language of logic. It's operating in the language of the body. And this is where the deepest, most uncomfortable layer of the subject reveals itself. Because if money were only about survival and status, the story would be relatively simple. But there's a third function wealth quietly performs, one that has almost nothing to do with either, and everything to do with meaning. For many people, financial ambition becomes, almost without their noticing, a substitute for a question they've never directly answered. What would make my life feel worthwhile? Wealth is an unusually convenient answer to that question because it doesn't require you to actually define what a meaningful life looks like. It simply asks you to accumulate and defers the harder question indefinitely. This is why so many people describe the strange emptiness of finally hitting a long-held financial goal, not disappointment in the money itself, but the sudden, disorienting realization that the goal was quietly functioning as a stand-in for a deeper sense of purpose they never got around to building. The psychologist Viktor Frankl, whose life's work centered on humanity's search for meaning, observed that when people lack a genuine sense of purpose, they tend to fill the vacancy with what he called a will to power, or, just as often, a will to acquire. Not because acquisition is inherently meaningless, but because it is available, measurable, and endlessly repeatable in a way that meaning-making often isn't. None of this means ambition is a mistake, or that financial security doesn't matter. It matters enormously, and the anxiety of genuine scarcity is real, urgent, and deserves to be taken seriously rather than philosophized away. But there is a difference between pursuing enough and pursuing more as a permanent substitute for a question you're afraid to ask directly. One has an end. The other, by its very design, cannot. Perhaps this is the quiet truth hidden beneath the entire subject of wealth. Not that money is meaningless, or that ambition is misguided, but that money was never actually the thing being pursued. Beneath the number was always a feeling, safety, status, worth, purpose, each one a different question wearing the same disguise. And no amount of accumulation can answer a question it was never actually designed to answer. So maybe the real work isn't finding the number that will finally feel like enough. It's this: if you already knew, with total certainty, that you were safe, that you belonged, and that your life already meant something, how much of what you're currently chasing would you still want?